Okay, so you've bought and installed Foundry, you've got it all set up and ready to go, and you're ready to start playing Savage Worlds. Well, how do you go about that? With this tutorial, I'm going to walk through some basics of how to set up characters, scenes, and some modules you might want to consider if you don't want to stick with the plain vanilla Savage Worlds. To begin, then, let's show you how to create a world. Since I'm already in one, I'm going to hit Return to Setup. Then I'm going to go over here to Game Worlds, select Create World, give my world a name. I'm going to use Science Fantasy Campaign just as an example. Note that that creates a data path. This is where the files will be stored within your Foundry installation. Select your game system. Right now I only have Savage Worlds installed. And if you want, you can put in a background image. That'll act as a screen when you first log in or when your players first go to log in for your campaign. If you want, you can put in an X section and a world description, but none of that's required. If you haven't already installed Savage Worlds, you can go over here to Game Systems, select Install Systems, and then up here in Package Name, type in the word Savage and hit the Install button. We've got our world now. I've created one called Vanilla Savage Worlds, and that's what we're going to use for this example. So I'm going to hit Launch, and then when you first go into the world, you're going to have to log in. So if I hit Log Out here, you're going to get a login screen like this. There'll be a single user Game Master with no password, so you can just select Game Master and jump right in. The background image will be whatever you selected, and if you've got a world description, that'll show up right here for your players. There's also a Return to Setup button here, where you can jump back to setup and change between different worlds, install modules, or install other systems. When you first go in, the system's going to be paused like this. All you need to do there is hit the space bar and you can make that game pause thing go away. You'll also get a default starting scene, which will replace later when we start putting scenes in. So to begin with, you're going to need some players. That means you're going to need to create users who can log into your system. You do that with this button here, the Game Settings and User Management. So over here, I can create some additional users that my players will use to log in and play their characters. So I'll just hit create additional user here. I'm going to say my first player's name is Steve. Leave the password blank. If in a real game, you're probably going to have a password depending on how you're hosting. Security's up to you. I'll put in a second player called Ashley. Those are going to be my two players. Over here, you can select their role. These have different levels of permissions. So the player is the basic level you're going to want for someone who's going to be a player in your game. Game Master is for you. You can decide exactly what people can do by hitting this Configure Permissions button. So can they broadcast audio and video? Can they ping? There's a whole bunch of different permissions here, but honestly, the defaults are basically fine. So I'm going to hit Save and Return here. That'll take me back into the world. And now, over in this lower corner, if I expand the list of players, I've got Ashley and Steve in here. You'll only see the players who are online if you leave it collapsed, but if you expand it, you can see all of them. Now that you have your players, it's time to build some characters. All of your characters are considered actors. So when you go to the Actors button here, you can select Create Actor. And since we're creating them for your players, we're going to say Player Character. We'll create a new character named Skull. And add an image to Skull. This is going to be the image that you see both on the list and on the token. I'm just going to grab an image from some that I already uploaded, but if you want to load your own, there are a couple places they can go. By default, they're going to go into user data or core data. You can, however, connect an Amazon S3 vault, which if you have a large amount of graphics to store, this might be a good bet, especially if you're using a hosted server rather than one of your own or a service to host Foundry. So I'm going to grab from my Amazon S3 bucket. We'll just go with Charles Lee here. And then I need to build out the character sheet. Make it a little bigger so it's a little easier to work with. So for attributes, I can go here, click the little gear, adjust them to whatever we've come up with as part of character creation. I can go in and I can edit the skills that I have here. As well as adding more. However, rather than clicking add, a good way to go is to go over here to your compendiums and grab the skills directly from Savage Worlds. So I can take the skills here, I can just drag them across, and it'll add in with a nice icon. And if you're using the paid core module for Savage Worlds, it'll add in the description of the skill as well. Notice when I put in fighting, my parry adjusted accordingly. I'm going to get rid of this skill that I created, and I'll throw in a couple of other ones like repair, shooting, and so on. The same basic idea applies for edges, hindrances, and gear. So I can go over here for edges and open this up, drag over the ones that I want. In some cases, that edge will have a mechanical effect with the regular Savage Worlds, but only if you activate it. In the case of these, however, they're just going to go in with the standard information. So we'll throw make him a martial artist, and then we'll put some hindrances on there as well. Again, dragging across mean, arrogant, and we'll say a secret, noting that the secret defaults to minor. If you want to make it a major, you have to go in there and check the box to say that it's a major hindrance. The star here means that it's active. So you'll see they now show up on quick access. This isn't particularly useful for edges and hindrances, so I'm going to turn them back off again, but it's very helpful for gear and powers. And then for gear, again, same idea. You can either create items directly or drag them across. The base Savage Worlds module does not have gear in it, but the paid module does. So I'm just going to add in manually a weapon for Skull here. We'll call it Skull Sword. So I'm noting that it's carried, it's a melee weapon, so I don't have to enter the range. If it was a ranged weapon, I would put in the range in the standard format that you'd see in a stat block. Leaving it blank indicates that it's a melee. And then to put in the strength, I do the @str plus d8 format. That shows that it's going to pull from the strength from the character and then put the rest in. No armor piercing, no shots. I can edit the description. This goes into rich text. You can put all kinds of things in there, including pictures. And you can also put in properties. So what trait does it use? Normally this would be fighting, and for melee weapons I'd put it at default, but that's what it puts in. But you can also put in modifiers of various kinds, templates that it uses, weapons that don't need reload, heavy weapons, and so on. If the weapon has more than one action, like a dagger that can be either used as melee or thrown, you can add more actions here, describing the action, whether it's trait or damage, the trait that it would be used, the modifier, rate of fire, and any shots used. This is a good way, for example, to model shotguns that will have different damage levels depending on range. And then up here in tweaks, you can add additional stats if there are any. In this case, we haven't set that up because it's vanilla Savage Worlds, but tweaks is always useful there. The last thing I'm going to do with my character is also check tweaks on him. in case, for example, he's got an edge that changes his pace or his running die or his maximum wounds or the number of bennies that he has. For initiative, there are specific edges that you might want to check here. You can also turn on and off automatic calculation of toughness and parry. And then I'm going to go to his prototype token. There's some settings here I might want to use to make him easier to use on the table, like whether or not you can see his name when you hover over it, or whether it's always displayed, and whether it's linked to the actor. What this is used for is an actor, like a player character, that is not a generic mook or extra, but a specific individual. What this does is make sure that the tokens data, when you drag it out onto the table, and the character's data on the character sheet are always the same. You can define whether the character is neutral, friendly, or hostile to the players. And you can, if you're using vision, you can turn that on and define a range for it. Last but not least, I'm going to click this little star here to make the skull sword active. That will mean it shows up on the quick access here. And I can use it when I'm ready to fight. Next up, we're going to create a character with powers. So I'll go back to my Actors tab, hit Create Actors. We'll make a new character called Raven. I'll once again grab something from my trusty S3 vault. And we'll go ahead and put some attributes in. One thing to note is that there's no validation of the character in this. So you can build a character any way you want. It's not going to conform to the standard character creation rules. So going over here to compendiums then, from my basic edges, I'm going to grab an arcane background. Notice as soon as I drop the arcane background on there, powers comes up as a tab. And I can do the same basic thing for powers. I can grab them and drag them on here. They're conveniently organized by level, so I know, unless I have the Born a Hero rule, that I'm only grabbing powers that are available to novices, but this doesn't take into account any special arcane backgrounds for particular settings. So we'll grab Bolt and Entangle and Healing, and we'll also load up some power points. Just like with skills, you can add these manually, but it's nice to go in and add them directly. The edit button lets you go in and edit. You can see PowerPoint cost, range, damage, and so on. And you're also going to want to make sure that you have an arcane skill of some kind. In this case, we're going to go with Weird Science. Now let's just do a quick check here. If I select Bolt, I have my damage costs, and I can also add and subtract power points. Notice that because I selected a star, they go in under quick access. And we'll give Raven also a ranged weapon. I'll just say rifle. Not one that's specifically aligned with any particular item. If you want to track ammunition, you can put that in here, identifying the specific type of ammo that you're going to worry about. So I could put in here, for example, large bullets. If I'm keeping things fairly generic, keep them fast, furious, and fun. And then I could add in here some large bullets. This allows some specific modules to track ammunition usage, which might be something you want to do. I'm going to say shots are 1. We're going to say this is a 10-round magazine. Notice you can also put in things like rate of fire and weight that are important for the weapon. So we've got our 2 characters now. Next up, we need to connect them to their players, and that's a 2-step process. First, I'm going to right-click and go down here to configure ownership. And since Ashley is playing Skull, I'm going to identify them as owner. And then I'm going to make all players an observer. This allows other people to see the character, but not to control it. So in general, you want your PCs to be able to see each other. So all players observer and an owner for the specific character are important. We'll do the same thing here for Raven. Assign Raven to Steve. And then over here on the player's side, I can go to user configuration and I can select the character that goes with that. So now over in the player section, you can see that Ashley is associated with Skull and Steve is associated with Raven. If you're familiar with Savage.us as a means of building characters, there's a quick way of getting characters from Savage.us into Foundry by means of a module. I'm just going to turn that one on briefly so you can see it. The module is called Savage.us importer. Pretty easy to remember. And as with any module or most modules, it's going to reload the system when you add it. Now when I go over to my Actors tab, I've got some buttons down here where I can import characters, a bestiary, or files. Exactly how this works depends on whether you're a wildcard member on Savage.us, in which case you can connect it directly like I have, or whether you're a standard user, in which case you'll need to export a file, a JSON, and then re-import it over here in Foundry. But if you're a wildcard member, you can just grab all your characters and import them accordingly. You can see I've got quite a few here that I can grab and pull in. Let's turn that module back off and continue putting our world together. The next thing we're going to do is create some scenes beyond the Foundry Virtual Tabletop scene that came by default. For here, I'm going to go to the Scenes tab. I'm going to create a couple different kinds of scenes. The first scene is what I like to call a backdrop scene. This is one that isn't intended to be a representation of a tactical battlefield or an area that the players are navigating, but rather is there for color or information, just to provide some kind of data about the world. So for this, we're going to have a Europe map. So you can change the navigation name if you want, but by default, it's just going to copy over the scene name. And if you've got a short name for the scene, that's usually fine. You can have a background and a foreground image, but for most maps, the background image is what you're really going to want. So I'm going to grab the file that I want, and I'm going to upload this again to my Amazon S3 by selecting the file from my downloads. Then hit select file. And I'm going to go over here to the grid and say this is gridless because this isn't a map I'm going to be using for maneuvering. For lighting, since this is not a map that's going to be explored, I'm not going to use token vision or fog exploration, but I am going to use global illumination to make sure that everything is viewable. And if I want, I can go in and put ambiance information, but for now, I'm just going to go with this. Note that when you save, it's going to change dimensions to match the dimensions of your map. Now that I have the Europe map, I can activate it. And now that I have more than one scene, I can go in and get rid of this Foundry Virtual Tabletop scene by right-clicking it on the scene here and going down to delete. So my Europe map, you'll notice this large frame around it. That's from the padding settings, which I usually forget to adjust. So I'm going to go in here and configure. And on the grid, where it says padding percentage, I'm going to set it down to 0. Sometimes it's helpful to have padding if you want to have an area around your map that players can maneuver in case it's a fairly small area. So I'll do save changes. So that's better. We don't have the big frame, but it's also kind of out of whack. It's not centered on the page. So I'm going to move it and zoom it a little bit. Moving is right click and drag. Zooming is the mouse wheel to get it the way I want it. Then I'm going to go back up here to configure. And I'm going to go to basics and use this initial view position. By capturing the current view, whenever I go back to this, it will come back to this map. Next, I'm going to create a scene with a grid. I'm going to use a square grid for this one, but the principles are the same for a hex grid. It's easier if you have a grid that you know is a specific size. It's a little more complicated if you don't. So we're going to assume we don't know the size of the grid. So I'm going to create a new scene, which is dueling ground. And just like before, I'm going to go over here to background image, go to my S3 storage, and then browse to find the image file that I want. And then hit select file to save it. This time I do want a square grid, and I'm going to guess that it's a 200 size grid. I don't want any padding, so I'm going to turn that off. I'm going to use 1-inch grid scale consistent with Savage Worlds. And this time there's no map, there's no walls or anything in my image. So I'm going to turn off fog, but I'm going to turn on global illumination. I'll say save. It changes the dimensions. And now I have my dueling ground scene. I'm going to go up here and activate it and see how I did. So I've got some grid here. That's good. The question is, how does that correspond to the real grid that I want? So let's grab my Raven guy here. And you can see he should be 1 square, but he's actually twice as big as he should be. That means it's a pretty easy calculation that you're dealing with a grid that is 100 pixels versus 200. Sometimes that can be harder. You might need to fine tune the grid in order to make it line up. So let me show an example of that. Let's change the grid configuration to something that isn't going to be quite so uniform. So now you can see I've got these grid lines in the middle. And what I need to do is get these to line up. That can be a trial and error process. Sometimes it's going to be more obvious than others. But basically, you just need to tweak that grid number until the grid scale lines up properly. You may also, depending on how the map is created, need to do an offset background to move the grid to line up. So for example, if I go in here and do a vertical offset of 50 pixels, now you can see the grid lines are more lined up. That first grid line is lined up properly, but you still aren't perfect. So I'm going to go back and, having done my trial and error, say, okay, this must be a 100 pixel grid. Oops, I left my offset in there. So let's get rid of that as well and save changes. That's a big pain in the butt to do manually, and there's no argument about that. So what I prefer to do is import my maps from a map maker like Dungeon Draft. And that's another module that you can turn on. In this case, it is Universal Battle Map Importer. And that's going to require me to restart when I save module settings. Now when I go to scenes, there's a Universal Battle Map Import tool. So I can go here. I can specify what the scene name is going to be, where I want to keep it. If you're using S3, you do have to fill in some information about your S3 storage, the bucket name and the region name. I can define if I want there to be an offset, which usually I don't. And then I can load one of these file formats and have my map generated immediately. The really nice thing about this is that it comes with object walls. So that means that if I've created a map that has a structure in it, then that structure is, the walls come in, the doors come in, everything comes in the way you would expect it to. It's a much, much faster way of getting your map into your Foundry instance. If you want to do the walls yourself, though, you can. Wall controls are right here. So I can draw different kinds of walls, terrain wall, standard walls, which look like this. Those are just going to block people from moving through. Doors like this. So I can put a door from here to here. It's a little tricky to do the drawing because you have to make sure you're on top of, but not exactly on top of, to connect the dots. So I can kind of drag this over and have them merge. I can put in invisible walls, which basically are windows, ethereal walls, which are visible but you can walk right through them. I can put in secret doors, and I can put in terrain walls. And terrain walls are kind of cool because they restrict visibility only after the second wall. It's a good way of showing things like hills or roofs of buildings. Let's see how this looks for a token that has vision. I'm going to grab Raven in here. And then I'm going to go over to my settings. And on grid, I am going to put fog exploration here, and I'm going to restrict to token vision. So now I need to make sure that my vision is set on Raven. So I'm going to grab him, go here to token, go to vision. Now I'm going to say vision is enabled. By default, you can leave it blank, and that's infinite vision. So now you'll see the walls are blocked off, and the section of the area behind the second terrain wall is blocked off. But if I move over here, now I'm all explored. And because I now have a line of sight to the back of that terrain wall, I can see all of that too. Again, much easier to bring that in from a map making tool via that import module. But we're going to go back and turn that one back off. And then we're going to show how to have a little bit of a fight. All right, we've got a scene, we've got some actors. Let's have a fight. The first thing you need to do to start off a combat is to make sure that each token that's going to be in the combat is toggled into combat state. You'll see that on this combat encounters tab, that both of them are now on the list. If you have extras, then you can right click on one of these guys and make them a group leader, and then select other tokens and make them as followers. That way all the extras will have the same initiative. So let's start our combat by going down here and clicking begin combat. Notice we automatically got initiative. Skull goes first. The initiatives themselves also show up in the chat here. So Skull is going to charge Raven with the Skull Sword. You can measure distances with this ruler button to see if Skull can get there without running, which pretty obviously he can. Another useful measurement tool are templates. Down here you have cone template, stream template, small, medium, and large blast templates that you can drop onto the battlefield if you've got a relevant power that does that. Well, Skull's going to charge in. Notice I tried to move there, but I was still on the ruler. If you're having trouble moving, the most likely scenario is that you're not in the select tokens mode. I'm just going to click and drag to move Skull over here. I can also move them with arrow keys. And then I'm going to open up Skull's character sheet, and I'm going to click on the Skull Sword here. So I'm going to get two buttons, a trait roll and a damage roll. I click on the trait roll button. It pops up this dialog for me to roll. If I've set up the character right, the only thing I have to do is hit roll. I can put in a multi-action penalty here. I can also, with the presets here, put in some kind of modification. Right now, there's no modifiers, so that makes it really easy. My roll is going to show up in my chat. So I rolled an 11. Comparing that to Raven's parry of 2, Raven is going to have a bad day. So I'm going to go back to the Skull Sword and select a damage roll. And in this case, I do want to roll it with a raise, since I vastly exceeded Raven's parry. Alright, so that's 9 damage to Raven. So Raven has a toughness of 5, which means that will shake and do 1 wound, which means I'm going to want to soak. So I will spend a Benny and make a vigor roll to soak that wound. I rolled a 5, so I succeed. I am therefore neither shaken nor wounded. So Raven is going to counter by trying to entangle Skull. So I can go over here to my entangle. And in this case, the quick access doesn't help me as much. I need to find my arcane skill, which in this case is weird science, and roll that. So here I am rolling my entangle skill. So my weird science skill roll is a 4. That means the entangle goes off. Because it's only a 4, however, that's going to limit how entangled Skull will be. So based on that successful roll, Skull will be entangled. Notice that also adds an effect to the quick access tab and automatically makes Skull distracted. Meanwhile, Raven just spent 2 power points. So I need to jump over here to power points and drop that down to 8. Now that Skull is entangled, Raven is going to back off to prepare to maybe shoot a bolt next round, depending on how he does. So I'm going to use the arrows to step through initiative. Skull's gone, Raven's gone, and then I'll move to the next turn. A couple of notes on these things. This button allows you to ping the combatants so you can see where they are. This button allows you to make the combatant invisible as the GM, which is handy if you've got hidden foes. This button incapacitates the target, which takes them off the initiative list. And this button puts you on hold. Moving on to the next round, let's see what happens. Skull draws initiative. So Skull is going to try to break out of their entangled state. That's going to mean going into the character sheet here, a strength check. So I'll click on here to roll strength. Notice it automatically added the entangled modifier. We'll then roll. Jumping back over to chat, I will see that the 2 is not sufficient. So Skull, not wanting to stay entangled, is going to Benny that. Spend the Benny on the character sheet, roll strength again. Still not good enough. Skull's going to keep their Bennies in place, which means that the turn order will then go over to Raven, and Raven's going to fire off a bolt. So once again, going to our weird science here. There's no modifier, so it's an easy roll. And a 6 is going to hit. Raven's doing well this combat so far. Going to bolt here, we do have a damage roll to roll out. So here I can click on the damage roll, make that roll. I didn't hit it with a raise, so it's a standard roll. And I do 4 damage. That's pretty sad and doesn't even get through Skull's toughness. So Raven's going to Benny that. Go back to bolt here and make another damage roll. That's better. With an 8, that's enough to shake Skull, so I can go here and add Shaken to their increasing list of things causing the problems. Moving on to the next round, Raven goes first. Spend the power point for the last bolt, and then we're going to turn right around and try another one. With a 6, that's going to hit once again. Raven makes the damage roll. With a whopping 17. So a 17 is going to cause 3 wounds. Obviously, it's time to start soaking. So Skull will spend a penny, make the vigor roll to try to soak some of that. Unfortunately, Skull critically fails. So there is no way to soak that, and Skull takes 3 wounds. 1, 2, 3. Skull is not having a good day. So, since Skull is shaken, I'm going to start out by trying a spirit roll, even though with 3 wounds and entangled, it's going to be a rough one to make. And it comes out just as one might expect. Therefore, I'm going to go ahead and spend the last penny to remove Shaken, so that Skull can at least try to become unentangled here. Unfortunately, that does not do the trick. Coming into a new round, Skull's going to have another chance. And with a 6, thanks to an amazing wild die roll, Skull manages to break loose. That removes Distracted and Entangled, and gives Skull an opportunity to move into close range again to try to hit with a Skull Sword. Raven, of course, is not having that and is going to try to entangle again. And with a 7, poor Skull is entangled once again. I have not been doing a great job on PowerPoints here, but that takes off an additional 3, 1 for last round's bolt and 1 for this round's entangle. New round. Raven goes first. Raven moves away. And since Skull is not shaken, Skull is going to take an opportunity to try to hit with the Skull Sword as Raven moves away. And a 6 will connect with a raise. So damage. That's going to be 8 damage. So as Skull moves away, as Raven moves away from Skull, Raven is unfortunately shaken, but is going to spend their last penny to unshake again immediately, so that they can do their bolt again. Here comes the weird science roll. Which hits. And let's see what happens with the bolt. With an 8 damage on bolt, that unfortunately drops Skull back into shaken again. Things are looking bad for Skull. Now that we've wrapped up our combat, let's talk about one other key thing you might want to do in your Savage Worlds Foundry game: a chase. To lay down cards for a chase, you can use tile controls. First thing though, you're going to have to locate your cards. In the standard installation, if you go to Tile Browser, you'll find the cards in Core Data here under Cards, and then you have a choice between Dark Gold and Light Soft. You can lay the tiles out by dragging them across to the board. However, you're probably going to want to adjust the asset size to make it a little bit smaller so that you don't end up with a gigantic card that doesn't fit on your map. A 400 pixel grid gives you a pretty big card, but if you've got a large enough map, that'll work for a chase. You can cut that size further and go up to 600 pixels to get a smaller one. You have a couple of options for how to select the cards that you're going to lay out for your chase. One option, low tech but effective, is to have a deck of cards on hand, deal them out, select the cards, and put them on the table. Alternatively, you can go here to the action deck and deal out a few cards. Nine being standard for a chase. We'll deal them out. For that to work, though, you're going to need to create a new card stack called a card hand. For you to deal two. So with that in place, I can go back to my action deck here. I'll shuffle it. And then I'll deal 9 cards to chase selection. That gets me the card for my chase deck. Then I can go over to my tiles, select them, and lay them out. You can also make this a little faster with a number of different modules that can lay out chase cards and chase matrices in various ways to make your life easier. Similarly, the Better Rolls and Swayed Tools modules both provide a lot of automation for combat that may make your life a little bit easier. Let's take a quick look at both of those. Starting with Better Rolls, currently on version 2, you'll see how the behavior changes. Better Rolls uses the chat window extensively. So if I go here to my character and I select the skull sword there, now I get a dialog box here where I can select my modifiers. I can add additional ad hoc modifiers if needed to add more trait dice and modify damage. So I'll roll for the skull sword here. Got a very respectable 9. And then I will, in this case, would be rolling raise damage to get a 10. One nice thing about Better Rolls is if you have targeted another character by selecting them and selecting target, it will tell you if you hit or failed based on that target's parry. Let me just get to the point. I'm going to re-roll many times until I actually hit. There we go. Hit with a raise. And then when I select raise damage, it's going to tell me how many wounds I inflicted and give me the option of inflicting those. Next, I'll enable Swayed Tools, but you'll notice that here in the chat, I've got a lot of junk created by the Better Rolls module that isn't displaying right. You can clear the chat log by hitting this delete button here. So let's activate Swayed Tools and see how it's different. I'm going to remove the conditions from Skull to give him a better chance of hitting Raven with his skull sword. Again, I'm going to move over here. I'm going to target Raven, select Skull again. And now, when I open up Skull and I select the skull sword, I'm going to get a dialog box on the screen. I can do my fighting roll here and my damage roll here with a raised damage. I can also put modifiers in here directly. In this case, I'm just going to do a straight up fighting roll, which on Raven is going to miss. Take the wounds off. Let's try again. That will hit. And then allow me to make a damage roll, which again shows me where I am. Some people prefer one interface, some people prefer another. They both have merit. This is definitely a choice for you to choose one or the other, or none if you prefer. One other module that comes highly recommended by nearly every Foundry user is Dice So Nice. I'm also going to enable Dice Tray to show you how that can be helpful as well. So here I've turned off Suede Tools and I've turned off Better Rolls, but I've turned on Dice Tray and Dice So Nice. The first thing you get with Dice Tray down here is you get the ability to roll dice just by clicking on them. With a modifier, you can increase or decrease, and you can set it to have a wild die and to ace. So I can make this skill roll at -2 for a D8 skill. And thanks to Dice So Nice, I'll get some cool 3D dice on the table. You notice the color of the dice matches the player color over here, both of which can be adjusted. So I can adjust the dice simply by going in here to user configuration and changing my player color. Dice So Nice works no matter where you're rolling your dice from. If I go into my character sheet and make an athletics roll, I'm still going to get my dice, now in my new color. There are many, many, many settings in Dice So Nice to make your dice cooler and more customized. This is my dice set right now, including a Benny. But I can go in here and select a theme like, say, Astral Sea, and my dice will adjust accordingly. And each player can adjust their dice the way they want them to. There are lots of preference for how long they fade out, what kind of a table surface you have. And you can even do a test roll from the settings to see if you like what you've got. So that brings us to an end of our tutorial on the basics of using Foundry with Savage Worlds. If you've enjoyed it, check out the Happy MonsterCast, which has an actual play using Foundry and Savage Worlds in multiple settings, from Legion of Liberty through Deadlands Noir, and coming soon, Holler. You'll find the Happy MonsterCast on YouTube, or as an audio podcast wherever you find your audio podcasts. You can also find us at happymonsterpress.com and as Happy Monster Press or Happy Monster PRS on a variety of social media platforms. Thanks for listening and happy gaming. The Foundry Virtual Tabletop is the intellectual property of Foundry Gaming, LLC. Savage Worlds is the intellectual property of Pinnacle Entertainment. All opinions on modules or techniques used in the Foundry Tabletop system are Scott Marchand Davis of Happy Monster Press's opinion alone.